Stuck in traffic, an impatient millionaire never imagined that his life would change in that instant. Looking to the side, he spotted a little girl locked in a car under the scorching sun, on the verge of fainting. Without hesitation, he broke the window and rescued her, racing against time to save her. But what began as an impulsive act soon became a journey that would change his life forever. The sun mercilessly punished the asphalt of New York City on that December afternoon. Richard Thompson adjusted the air conditioning in his latest model Mercedes while impatiently watching the red light that seemed to last an eternity. At 45, the businessman had achieved everything he had always dreamed of: considerable fortune, respect in the financial market, and an unshakable reputation as a pragmatic and determined man. His empire had begun with a small brokerage firm and, over 2 decades, had transformed into one of the country's largest financial conglomerates. Richard prided himself on never having made decisions based on emotions. Numbers, statistics, and cold analysis were his only advisors. "Feelings are for the weak," he used to say in his motivational speeches. The office of Thompson Investments occupied 3 floors of one of the most luxurious buildings on Wall Street, and it was from there that Richard was returning after another successful meeting. His thoughts were focused on the next deal when a peculiar sound penetrated the acoustic isolation of his car. Initially, he ignored it, but something about that noise deeply disturbed him. Turning to identify the source of the sound, his eyes encountered a scene that would change his life forever. In a worn-out Ford Focus, parked under the scorching sun, a girl of about 5 years old was trapped in the back seat. Her little red and sweaty face betrayed the imminent danger she was in, while her small hands weakly beat on the window in a silent plea for help. Time seemed to freeze. Richard, who had always prided himself on his rationality, felt something awaken within him, a visceral urgency he had never experienced before. Without thinking twice, he abandoned his imported car in the middle of traffic and ran towards the vehicle. Attempts to open the doors were futile. They were all locked. "Someone help!" he shouted, his normally controlled voice now laden with desperation. Passers-by passed by, some stopped to observe, but no one took action. The girl was beginning to show signs of fainting, her little brown eyes losing their sparkle with each passing second. It was then that Richard made a decision that contradicted everything he represented. He ran back to his car, grabbed the fire extinguisher, and without hesitation, broke the Ford Focus's window. The sound of shattering glass attracted even more attention, but he didn't care about the legal consequences at that moment. Carefully, so as not to hurt the child, he managed to reach her and remove her from the vehicle. Her little body was too hot, worryingly hot. Without wasting time, he ran back to his Mercedes, turned the air conditioning on full blast, and set off towards the nearest hospital. During the journey, while driving with an urgency he had never felt before, something strange was happening inside him. Tears, the first in more than 2 decades, began to blur his vision. "Hang in there, little one," he murmured repeatedly, his voice choked with an emotion he couldn't control. Upon arriving at Mount Sinai Hospital, he entered carrying the girl in his arms, shouting for help. The medical team acted quickly, taking her for emergency care. Richard stood frozen in the middle of the lobby, his Italian designer shirt soaked with sweat, his hands trembling as he watched the doctors move away with that little life that, for some inexplicable reason, had touched his stone heart. A nurse approached, offering him a glass of water and asking about the child's parents. It was then that reality hit him. He knew absolutely nothing about that girl. He didn't know her name, her story, or how she had ended up alone in that car. For the first time in his life, Richard Thompson, the man who always had an answer for everything, was completely lost. And surprisingly, that feeling didn't bother him as much as it should. Something inside him had irrevocably changed on that hot December afternoon. The man who had woken up that morning, cold, calculating, and distant, was beginning to give way to someone he didn't recognize himself. Someone who, for the first time in a long time, felt. The clock in the waiting room marked 6:45 p.m. when the doctor finally appeared. "Richard, who had spent the last 2 hours alternating between making calls to cancel appointments and moments of deep reflection, stood up instantly. Dr. Paul Martinez, as indicated by his badge, wore a serene expression. That relieved part of the businessman's anxiety. "Mr. Thompson, the girl is stable now," informed the doctor. "You arrived just in time. A few more minutes in that car and the consequences could have been irreversible." Richard felt a lump in his throat, imagining what could have happened. "She's conscious now and asking for her mother." The last sentence hit Richard like a punch to the stomach. The mother. Where could she be? What kind of person would leave a child locked in a car under the scorching sun? His hands involuntarily clenched into fists, something that didn't go, unnoticed by the doctor. "We've already contacted Child Protective Services," continued Dr. Paul. "The girl's name is Emily. She's 6 years old, and from what we've been able to gather, she's been living with her uncle since she became an orphan. Apparently, he left her in the car while he took care of some business." Richard felt a wave of indignation course through his body. Some business? What business could be more important than a child's life? His voice, normally controlled, betrayed his contained anger. "Would you like to see her?" The doctor's question caught Richard by surprise. His first impulse was to refuse. After all, he had already done his part, hadn't he? But something inside him, something new and inexplicable, pushed him forward. In the room, Emily seemed even smaller in the hospital bed, her big brown eyes fixed on Richard as soon as he entered. To his surprise, she smiled. "It was you who helped me, wasn't it? I saw you breaking the window. You looked like a superhero." Those simple and innocent words provoked a revolution within him. Richard, who had always looked down on displays of affection, felt his eyes water. He approached the bed and, hesitantly, sat down in the chair beside it. "How are you feeling, Emily?" he asked, surprised by the gentleness in his own voice. "Better now. But I don't want to go back to Uncle Jack's house." Tears began to form in the girl's eyes. "He always leaves me alone. He says he doesn't have time to take care of me, that I mess up his life." At that moment, Sarah, the hospital's social worker, entered the room. After introducing herself, she explained that she was trying to locate Emily's uncle without success. "The phone number we have is deactivated, and the registered address seems to be outdated." Richard watched Emily play distractedly with the hem of the hospital sheet. Something stirred inside him, an unfamiliar feeling of responsibility and protection. Without thinking much about the consequences, he turned to Sarah. "What will happen to her?" "Well, normally in cases like this, while we investigate the family situation, the child is sent to a temporary shelter," explained the social worker. "No?" The firmness in his own voice surprised Richard. There must be another alternative. Sarah studied the businessman with interest. "Actually, there is the possibility of temporary guardianship by a substitute family, as long as properly evaluated and approved by the court." Richard's thoughts were racing at 1,000 miles an hour. He, who had always made decisions based on spreadsheets and risk analyses, was about to do something completely irrational. But for the first time in his life, he felt it was the right thing to do. What if I applied?" The words came out before he could contain them. Sarah raised her eyebrows, clearly surprised. "Mr. Thompson, do you realize the responsibility this entails?" Richard looked again at Emily, who was now watching him with a mixture of hope and curiosity. He remembered his own lonely childhood, his always absent parents, dedicated only to the family business. He thought of his empty mansion in the Hamptons, the solitary dinners, the endless nights of work. "I have a big house, more than sufficient financial resources, and I can offer her all the comfort and security she needs," he argued, his mind already tracing plans and possibilities. "It's not just a material matter, Mr. Thompson," Sarah explained patiently. "A child needs time, attention, affection." "I know," Richard interrupted, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. "And I'm willing to learn, to change, to be what she needs me to be." The Thompson mansion had never seemed so empty to Richard as on that night, as he walked through the impeccably decorated rooms. After leaving the hospital, where Emily would remain under observation for another 24 hours, he returned home with a clear mission: to transform that cold and aseptic space into a true home. Martha, his housekeeper for over 15 years, watched, curiously as he inspected each room of the house with a different look. "We need to prepare a room for a child," he announced, stopping in front of one of the guest rooms that had never been used. "A child, sir?" Martha couldn't hide her surprise. In all these years, Richard had never shown interest in starting a family. His life had always been exclusively dedicated to business. "Yes, Martha, a 6-year-old girl." And then, for the first time since they had known each other, Richard sat at the kitchen table and opened his heart to someone. He told her about the encounter with Emily, about the uncle's negligence, about his impulsive decision to apply for temporary guardianship. Martha listened to everything in silence, a small smile forming on her lips. When Richard finished, she simply said, "Finally, Mr. Thompson, finally you're truly living." The next morning, Richard woke up earlier than usual. He had an important meeting with his legal team at 8 a.m., but before that, he needed to resolve some personal matters. He called his assistant, Patricia, who for 10 years had managed his schedule with military precision. "Patricia, I need you to reorganize all my commitments for the next few weeks. Top priority only for what's absolutely unavoidable." On the other end of the line, there was a moment of stunned silence. "And I also want you to find the best schools in the area, elementary school, 1st grade." As he drove to the office, Richard reflected on the changes he would need to make in his life. His 16-hour daily work routine would need to be drastically reduced. The business dinners that often extended into the early hours would have to be rethought, and his apartment in Chicago, which he used to visit monthly, might need to be sold. At the meeting with the legal team, he surprised everyone with his new project. "I want you to prepare all the necessary documentation for a temporary guardianship process," he announced, ignoring the expressions of astonishment around the table. "And I also want to thoroughly investigate this child's situation. Where is the uncle? Why did she become an orphan? I want all possible information." Charles Roberts, his lawyer for over a decade, cleared his throat before speaking. "Richard, are you sure about this? It's an enormous responsibility, not to mention the risks to your image. A single businessman trying to get custody of a child. The press will have a field day." "For the first time in my life, Charles, I'm not thinking about risks or my image. I'm thinking only about what's right." The conviction in his voice silenced any other argument. After the meeting, Richard received a call from Sarah, the social worker. Emily had asked about him several times during the morning. "She seems to have created a very strong bond with you," Sarah commented. "But I need to warn you, the approval process for temporary guardianship is not simple. We'll have to do a complete evaluation of your conditions, not just financial, but emotional and psychological." "I'll do whatever is necessary," Richard replied without hesitation. "In fact, I've already started making some changes at home. Martha, my housekeeper, is transforming one of the rooms, and I hired a children's decorator for this afternoon." Sarah smiled on the other end of the line. "That's very good, Mr. Thompson, but you know what would be even better? If you came to visit Emily now. She's about to have lunch and asked if you'd like to join her." Richard looked at his day's schedule, full of important commitments: meetings with investors, conference calls with international partners, presentations to the board. At any other moment in his life, nothing in the world would make him cancel these commitments. But now, something had changed. Lunch at the hospital with Emily was a revealing experience for Richard. Sitting next to the girl's bed, he watched fascinated as she transformed the mashed potatoes into a volcano and made airplanes with the pieces of chicken. It was behavior that just a few days ago he would have considered inappropriate and immature. Now, inexplicably, he found it charming. "Uncle Richard," said Emily, catching him by surprise with the affectionate treatment, "do you have other children?" The innocent question made him choke on the coffee he was drinking. "No, Emily. Actually, I never thought much about having children before." "Why?" The genuine curiosity in her big eyes completely disarmed him. "Well, I was always very busy. With work. I always thought I didn't have time for family." "But now you have time." The question, so direct and simple, made him reflect deeply. How to explain to a 6-year-old child that he was completely lost, trying to reorganize his entire life because of a casual encounter that had lasted only a few minutes? I'm learning to have Emily. I'm learning many things lately, he answered, with sincerity, surprising himself. At that moment, Patricia, his assistant, appeared at the door of the room. Her expression was a mixture of concern and urgency. "Mr. Thompson, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we have a situation. The company board is meeting in an extraordinary session. They demand your immediate presence." Richard felt the familiar weight of corporate responsibility tense his shoulders. He looked at Emily, who continued playing distractedly with her food, and then at Patricia, who held her tablet with dozens of notifications flashing. "Tell them I'm in an unavoidable commitment," he replied, surprising both Patricia and himself. "But sir, they're questioning your latest decisions. There are rumors about your emotional stability circulating in the market. The company's stock has fallen 3% just this morning." Emily, sensing the tension in the air, stopped playing with her food. "Do you need to go, Uncle Richard?" Her small voice carried a note of disappointment that broke his heart. It was then that Richard had an idea, something that the old Richard would never consider. "Patricia, how long until the meeting starts?" 20 minutes, sir." "Great. Set up the video conference on my cell phone. I'll participate from right here." Patricia widened her eyes but nodded, her fingers already flying over the tablet. In the following minutes, while Patricia set up the call, Richard explained to Emily that he would need to have an important meeting, but that he wouldn't leave her side. The girl, fascinated by the idea, promised to be quiet, like a little mouse, making Richard smile at the comparison. The board meeting was tense from the first moment. The serious faces of the board members filled the cell phone screen, their expressions varying between concern and disapproval. "Richard, there are rumors that you're making hasty decisions," began Albert Mendoza, the chairman of the board. "Important. Meeting cancellations, drastic changes in the schedule, and now we're informed that you intend to take custody of an unknown child." Richard took a deep breath, feeling Emily's curious gaze upon him. "Gentlemen, in 20 years of career, have I ever made a decision that harmed this company? No, but in 2 decades we transformed a small brokerage firm into one of the largest financial conglomerates in the country. We did this by following numbers, statistics, probabilities. But do you know what I've learned in the last few days?" Richard paused, briefly looking at Emily. "I've learned that some values can't be calculated in spreadsheets." The silence that followed was interrupted by a small sneeze from Emily, who immediately covered her mouth with her hands, widening her eyes in a silent apology. To everyone's surprise, Richard smiled, a genuine smile that few there had ever witnessed. A week after the incident that changed his life, Richard was in his office at Thompson Investments when Charles Roberts, his lawyer, entered without being announced. His grave expression indicated that the news wouldn't be good. "We found Emily's uncle," announced Charles, dropping a folder on the mahogany desk. "Jack Sanders, 42 years old, and the story is more complicated than we imagined." Richard sat up straighter in his chair, feeling his heart race. In the last few days, since Emily had been discharged from the hospital, he had dedicated himself to preparing everything to receive her in his home. The room was already ready, decorated in soft shades of lilac and green, filled with children's books and carefully selected educational toys. "Jack showed up this morning at Child Protective Services," continued Charles. "He's contesting your initiative to request temporary guardianship. He claims he fell ill that day, that it was an isolated situation, and that he has always taken good care of his niece since her sister. Well, since what happened to Emily's parents." Richard felt a wave of anger grow in his chest. Taken good care? He abandoned a child inside a car in the middle of summer. How dare he say he takes good care of her? "The problem, Richard, is that legally he is Emily's guardian, and more. We discovered that he's in serious financial difficulties. There are speculations that he might use the situation to try some kind of deal." The implication was clear. Jack could try to extract money from Richard, using Emily as a bargaining chip. The businessman stood up from his chair and walked to the window, observing the city stretching below. For years, he himself had used difficult situations to make advantageous deals. Now he was on the other side. "There's one more thing," said Charles hesitantly. "We investigated Emily's background, her parents." He paused, choosing his words. Her mother was a public school teacher. Her father was a musician. They lived a simple but happy life, from what we could gather. Until what, Charles? Until they lost everything in a fraudulent investment scheme, a scam perpetrated by a brokerage firm. Charles made a significant pause. Stellar Investments. Richard felt as if the air had been sucked out of the room. Stellar Investments had been his first big acquisition 10 years ago. At the time, he knew the company had problems, but the price was too low to ignore. After the purchase, his legal department took care of burying all the lawsuits with confidentiality agreements. Emily's parents. Richard could barely form the words. They were part of the group of investors who lost everything. After that, they faced difficulties, had to move to a more distant neighborhood. It was when Emily was first left in her uncle's care so they could work overtime. Richard closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the irony of fate. Somehow, the universe had conspired to place in his arms precisely the child whose parents had been indirectly affected by his business decisions. The phone on his desk rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Sarah, the social worker. "Mr. Thompson, Emily is asking for you. She refuses to have lunch until she talks to Uncle Richard." At that moment, something crystallized inside him. The past didn't matter. The legal complications or extortion attempts didn't matter. What mattered was the present and the future he could build. "Charles, I want you to assemble the best legal team possible," he said, his voice regaining its characteristic firmness. "We're not going to play Jack's game, but we're not going to back down either. Emily deserves a chance to be happy, and I intend to ensure that." "And what about the Stellar Investments story?" Richard thought for a moment. "We're going to do what should have been done 10 years ago. Locate all the affected investors, all of them. We're going to compensate them with interest and monetary correction. And we're going to create an educational fund in Emily's parents' name." While Charles was taking notes, Richard grabbed his jacket. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have an important lunch with a young lady who's teaching me more about life than 20 years in the financial market." The children's restaurant chosen by Emily was packed at that lunch hour. Children ran between the colorful tables, while parents tried, without much success, to keep them seated. In other times, Richard would have considered that chaotic environment inappropriate for a meal. Now he observed everything with different eyes, especially Emily's radiant smile as she saw the waiters dressed as superheroes. "Uncle Richard, look! That one is Spider-Man!" she exclaimed, excitedly pointing to a young waiter who was juggling plates. Richard smiled, but his heart was heavy with the recent revelations about her parents. Sarah, who was accompanying them as part of the evaluation process for temporary guardianship, carefully observed the interaction between the two. "Emily," she began gently, "do you remember your parents well?" The girl stopped playing with the napkin, folded into an airplane shape, and became thoughtful. "I remember Mom singing to me before bed, and Dad playing guitar. He played in a band." Richard felt a lump in his throat. "And did they talk about what happened? About having to move?" "Mom was very sad once. She cried in secret, but I saw. Dad said we were going to get everything back, that we just had to have faith." Emily frowned, as if trying to remember something important. "But then they had to work a lot, really a lot, and I stayed with Uncle Jack." Sarah gave Richard a significant look. It was evident that Emily, even so young, carried deep marks from that difficult period. "And how was it staying with your Uncle Jack?" Sarah asked carefully. Emily fiddled with the straw of her orange juice, avoiding looking directly at them. "He was always angry. He said I was a lot of trouble, that I cost too much money. Sometimes he would leave and leave me alone. He said it was just for a little while, but it took a long time for him to come back." Richard felt his determination grow even stronger. Not only did he need to protect Emily from the present, but also help her overcome the wounds of the past, a past that, ironically, he had helped create with his business decisions. "Emily," he called softly, waiting until she looked at him. "Would you like to learn to play guitar like your dad?" The girl's eyes lit up. "Can I really?" "Of course you can. And you know what? I just remembered that I have an old guitar at home. It was my father's. I never learned to play. Maybe it's..." Time we gave it a new use. Sarah smiled, making notes on her clipboard. The way Richard was handling the situation, seeking connections with Emily's past instead of trying to erase it, was a positive sign. After lunch, while Emily played in the restaurant's kids area, Sarah took the opportunity to talk privately with Richard. "You're doing very well, you know, but I need to warn you, the process can get complicated with the uncle's interference." "We're already taking care of that," Richard replied, watching Emily play with other children. "But there's something else I need to do, something important." He told Sarah about Stellar Investments and its connection to Emily's parents' past. The social worker listened to everything attentively without interrupting. "What do you intend to do?" she asked when he finished. "I'm going to fix everything. I can't bring her parents back, but I can honor their memory. I'm going to create a foundation in their name to help families who have gone through similar situations. And more importantly, I'm going to make sure Emily knows the true story of her parents, that she knows they were honest people who fought until the end." At that moment, Emily came running back to them, her cheeks flushed from playing. "Uncle Richard, there's a girl over there who also wants to learn guitar. Can we have lessons together?" Richard smiled, feeling his eyes water. "Of course you can, Princess. In fact, how about we create a little music school? We could bring in other teachers, have various instruments. Like a band?" Emily's eyes sparkled. "Exactly like a band. And you know what we could name it?" The first hearing to discuss Emily's guardianship was scheduled for that morning. Richard adjusted his tie in front of the mirror, trying to maintain his composure, while Martha helped Emily get ready in the room next door. The last few weeks had been intense. Visits from Child Protective Services, psychological evaluations, interviews with social workers, and an endless series of documents to fill out. "Uncle Richard?" Emily's voice brought him back to the present. She was standing at the door of his room wearing a light blue dress and white shoes. Martha had braided her hair into 2 plaits, giving her an even more angelic look. "Do I have to see Uncle Jack today?" The question made his heart tighten. "Yes, sweetie, he'll be there at the courthouse, but don't worry, I'll be with you the whole time. Do you promise you won't let me go away with him?" Her eyes were watery, revealing a fear that broke his heart. Richard knelt down to be at her height. "Emily, look at me. Remember what we talked about promises, that they're sacred and that we should never break them." She nodded, wiping away a stubborn tear. "Then I promise, I'll do everything in my power to keep you safe and happy, always." On the way to the courthouse, Richard received a call from Charles. "We have a problem," said the lawyer. "Jack showed up with a new lawyer, and it's not just anyone, it's Mr. Miller." Richard felt a chill down his spine. Frank Miller was known for being one of the most ruthless lawyers in family cases. His specialty was manipulating public opinion, turning seemingly simple cases into true media circuses. When they arrived at the courthouse, they found a small crowd of reporters at the entrance. Miller had already started his work. "Mr. Thompson," the journalist shouted, "is it true that you're using your financial influence to take custody of a child from her own family?" Richard protected Emily with his body, quickly guiding her inside the building. In the lobby, they found Jack, accompanied by Miller. Emily's uncle wore a simple suit, clearly new, and had a rehearsed expression of concern on his face. "Emily, my dear," Jack tried to approach, but the girl hid behind Richard's legs, trembling slightly. "Please, keep your distance," Charles warned, positioning himself between them. Miller smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Look at that. The child is clearly being manipulated by the millionaire. Typical case of parental alienation." Before Richard could respond, Sarah arrived with the judge responsible for the case, Judge Beatrice Campbell. The magistrate, a middle-aged woman with keen eyes, quickly dismissed the reporters and led everyone to her office. "Let's make one thing very clear," the judge began as soon as everyone was seated. "I'm not interested in media circus or power games. My only concern is Emily's well-being." Over the next 2 hours, all sides presented their arguments. Miller painted a picture of Jack as a dedicated uncle who had made only one isolated mistake, pressured by financial difficulties. He suggested that Richard was using his economic power to buy a family. When it was his turn, Richard surprised everyone. Instead of counter-attacking, he simply presented his plan. The foundation in Emily's parents' name, the music school project, the reports from Child Protective Services visits showing the girl's progress. "Your Honor," he concluded, "I'm not here to buy anything. I'm here because for the first time in my life, I found something that money can't buy, the love of a child who taught me to be a better person." The judge observed Emily, who was quietly playing with a doll in a corner of the room. "Emily, dear, could you come here for a moment?" Emily walked timidly to Judge Beatrice's desk, who moved her chair back and leaned in to be closer to the girl. With a gentle smile, the magistrate began a conversation that would change the course of several lives in that room. "Emily, do you know why we're all here today?" the judge asked softly. The girl nodded, clutching her doll to her chest. "It's to decide if I'm going to live with Uncle Richard or with Uncle Jack." "That's right. And how do you feel about that?" Emily looked briefly at Richard, then at Jack, and then back at the judge. Her next words came out softly but clear enough for everyone to hear. "With Uncle Richard, I'm not afraid." The simple and honest statement provoked different reactions in the room. Jack visibly paled while Miller shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Richard felt his eyes water, and Sarah made quick notes on her clipboard. "And why were you afraid before, dear?" the judge continued. "Because Uncle Jack always left me alone. He said I was a burden, that I cost him too much money." Emily paused, as if gathering courage. "Once I heard him talking on the phone that he wanted to send me far away because he didn't want to take care of me anymore." Jack stood up abruptly. "That's a lie. She's making this up." "Silence." The judge's voice cut through the air. "Mr. Sanders, one more interruption and you'll be removed from the room." Beatrice turned her attention back to Emily. "And how is it living with Uncle Richard?" The girl's face lit up. "It's really cool. He takes me to school every day, even when he has important meetings. We're learning guitar together and he never gets mad when I mess up the notes. Martha makes chocolate pancakes for breakfast, and there's a library full of books in my room." She paused as if remembering something important. "And you know what's the coolest thing? Uncle Richard has a picture of my parents on the nightstand, in my room. He tells me stories about how they were brave and kind. Uncle Jack never talked about them." The judge looked significantly at Sarah, who nodded, silently confirming the information. Then she addressed Jack. "Mr. Sanders, do you have anything to say about these accusations?" Miller tried to intervene, but Jack stopped him with a gesture. Something had changed in his expression. The mask of the dedicated uncle was beginning to crumble. "Hi," he began, running his hand over his face. "I didn't ask for this. When she was gone, suddenly I found myself responsible for a child. I wasn't prepared. I didn't know how to handle it. Money was tight. The bills just kept piling up. So you decided that the solution was to abandon a 6-year-old child locked in a car in the middle of summer." The judge's voice carried a controlled indignation. "I was just going to settle some debts. I didn't think it would take so long." Jack stopped talking, realizing how much his words incriminated him even more. Richard, who had remained silent until then, stood up. "Your Honor, if I may." After an affirmative nod from the judge, he continued, "I'd like to make a proposal to Mr. Sanders." Everyone in the room stared at him in surprise, especially Jack. "I recently discovered that Emily's parents were victims of a financial scheme that indirectly involved a company I acquired in the past. As part of the reparation process, I'm creating a fund to help all affected families. I'd like to include Mr. Sanders in this program." "What?" Jack looked confused. "I offer financial help and a job opportunity in one of the social projects of the foundation we're creating. In exchange, I ask only that you be honest about your limitations and allow Emily to stay where she feels safe and loved." The silence that followed Richard's proposal was broken by a contained sob. To everyone's surprise, it came from Jack. The man who minutes before was trying to maintain a facade of a dedicated uncle now let tears flow freely down his face. "I failed my sister," he said, his voice choked. "I promised I would take care of Emily, but the truth is I never knew how to be the father she needed. Every time I look at her, I see my sister. I see my brother-in-law. I see everything we lost." Emily, who was still close to the judge's desk, looked at her uncle with a mixture of fear and pity. Richard realized that despite everything, there was still a bond there, complicated and imperfect, but real. "Mr. Sanders," Judge Beatrice intervened, "do you understand that your actions put Emily at risk?" "Yes, ma'am," Jack replied, wiping his tears with his sleeve. "And I also understand that she's better now. I see how she smiles around Mr. Thompson, how her eyes shine when she talks about him. That's how my sister used to look at the people she loved." Miller, realizing he was losing control of the situation, tried to intervene. "My client is emotionally distraught, Your Honor. I request a recess to—" "No," Jack interrupted, surprising his lawyer. "Enough games. Emily deserves better than this, better than what I can offer." Turning to Richard, he continued, "You're a businessman, aren't you? You must be wondering why I did all this, why I hired an expensive lawyer to fight for custody, when I clearly can't take care of her." Richard just nodded, waiting for Jack to continue. "The truth is I was angry at the system that destroyed my family, angry at myself for not being able to be better, angry at seeing a rich stranger show up out of nowhere and make everything seem so easy." Jack paused, looking at Emily. "But mainly, I was afraid of losing the last little piece of my sister that I had left." Judge Beatrice carefully observed the interaction, while Sarah made notes on her clipboard. The atmosphere in the room had completely changed, the previous tension giving way to something deeper and more meaningful. "Uncle Jack?" Emily's small voice surprised everyone. It was the first time she had addressed her uncle directly since the beginning of the hearing. "You don't have to be angry. Uncle Richard said we can have a band, like Daddy had. You can come see us play if you want." The simplicity and purity of the childish invitation moved everyone in the room. Jack looked at Richard, who nodded in confirmation. "Actually," said Richard, "I think it would be important for Emily to maintain some contact with her biological family. Of course, in a supervised and structured way, always thinking about her well-being. You could participate in the Foundation's projects, rebuild your life, and gradually rebuild your relationship with Emily as well." Judge Beatrice allowed herself a small smile. In her years on the bench, she rarely saw cases take such a positive turn. "Mr. Sanders, do you accept Mr. Thompson's proposal?" Jack looked at his little niece, then at the man who had done what he couldn't, give Emily a true home. "Yes, Your Honor. And I'm sorry for everything, Emily. Uncle Jack is going to try to be a better person now." Emily let go of the judge's hand and, to everyone's surprise, walked over to Jack. With the innocence that only a child possesses, she hugged him. "It's okay, Uncle Jack. Uncle Richard said that sometimes we need to forgive people so our hearts don't get heavy." Richard observed the scene with a mix of emotions. In a few months, his life had changed completely. The man who only cared about numbers and profits now understood the true meaning of wealth. A year had passed since the hearing that changed so many lives. The old ballroom of the Thompson mansion, which had never hosted a true celebration, was now decorated with colorful balloons and festive banners. It was Emily's 7th birthday, and also the official inauguration of the Sarah and Peter Wilson Foundation in honor of her parents. Richard proudly watched as Emily, dressed in a beautiful pink dress, played guitar alongside other children from the social project. In recent months, the music school had grown beyond his initial expectations, serving dozens of children from underprivileged communities. And there, among the volunteer teachers, was Jack, teaching percussion, finally, finding his own path to redemption. Martha, who now coordinated the entire social project in addition to continuing to take care of the house, circulated among the guests with a tray of sweets. Her smile revealed the joy of seeing the mansion, once so silent and cold, overflowing with life and music. "Mr. Thompson?" Sarah, who continued to follow the case even after the guardianship process was finalized, approached with an envelope in her hands. It just arrived from the courthouse. Judge Campbell insisted on sending it personally. Richard carefully opened the envelope, although he already imagined its contents. It was the final authorization for the definitive adoption process. His eyes scanned the document, pausing on a handwritten note from the judge herself. "Congratulations on building together the true meaning of family." Emily, who had finished her performance, ran up to him. "Dad, did you see how I didn't miss any chords this time?" She still alternated between calling him Uncle Richard and Dad, and every time she used the second option, his heart warmed in a special way. "Yes, I did, my princess. You were perfect." He knelt down to be at her height. "And you know, what? I have a special gift for you. More special than the new guitar." Richard smiled. "Much more. From today on, if you want, you can officially be my daughter. Forever." Emily's eyes widened. "You mean now you're going to be my real dad? Not just in my heart?" "Yes, but only if you want." Her answer came in the form of a tight hug, the kind only a child knows how to give, full of pure and sincere love. "I always wanted to, but..." She hesitated for a moment. "Can I still have two dads? The daddy in heaven and you?" Richard felt tears come to his eyes. "Of course you can, my love. And you know what? I'm sure your parents would be very happy to see you. Like this, happy and surrounded by love." Jack approached the group timidly, carrying a small package. "Emily, I also have a present for you." He handed the gift to his niece, who opened it carefully. It was a photo album, filled with images of Sarah and Peter, Emily's parents, photos of their wedding, the band, family moments. "I found these photos stored in an old box," Jack explained. "I thought you should have them." Emily flipped through the album reverently, her small fingers tracing the smiling faces in the photographs. Richard noticed that some of the photos showed Peter playing the same model of guitar he had bought for Emily. "Look, Dad," exclaimed Emily, pointing to a specific photo. "Daddy is playing just like us." Amidst the festivities, Richard observed the room full of life. Children playing, music in the air, smiles all around. His gaze wandered over the decoration until it found a large banner hanging on the wall. "New Dreams Musical Project, Sarah and Peter Wilson Foundation." Charles, his lawyer and now close friend, approached with a glass of champagne. "You know, Richard, when you told me your plans a year ago, I thought you had lost your mind. The entire financial market thought you were having a nervous breakdown." Richard laughed. "And wasn't I? The man who only thought about profits and acquisitions, suddenly transforming his mansion into a music school for underprivileged children. But look at the result," continued Charles, gesturing to the surroundings. "You haven't just changed Emily's life. You're changing the lives of dozens of children, and your own life too." Richard watched Emily running back to join the other children, her pink dress twirling in the air, her smile lighting up the whole environment. He remembered that hot December afternoon, the muffled sound of crying coming from a car, the impulsive decision that changed everything. "You know, Charles," he said, his voice choked with emotion, "I spent years believing that success was measured by the numbers in the bank account. But that little girl, she taught me that true wealth is in the smiles we provide, in the lives we touch, in the love we share." The music started again, now with all the children from the project singing together. Emily, standing in the center of the group, strummed her guitar with concentration, her face radiant with happiness. Jack kept the rhythm with his drum, finally at peace with himself. Martha distributed more sweets, her cheeks flushed with joy, and Richard, the man who once thought he had everything, finally understood. He hadn't just saved Emily that December afternoon. Emily had saved him too. Together they had discovered the true meaning of family, proving that the strongest bonds are not always those of blood, but those we build with love, forgiveness, and hope.